Most people know the basic story. Israel was delivered from Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. They received the law at Mount Sinai. And then, somehow, they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. But the question is deeper than most people realize. Why 40 years? Why did a journey that could have taken weeks become the story of an entire generation? At first, it sounds like a delay. But it was more than a delay. The wilderness was not just empty space between Egypt and the Promised Land. It became the place where one generation ended and another generation was prepared to begin. That is the pattern most people miss. One generation saw the promise and turned back in fear. Another generation stood at the river and entered by faith. One failed. One finished. The story begins after Israel has already seen more miracles than most people in Scripture ever saw. They saw the plagues fall on Egypt. They saw the Red Sea open. They saw bread fall from heaven. They saw water come from the rock. They saw fire and cloud leading them through the wilderness. This was not a people who lacked evidence. They had seen the power of God with their own eyes. And yet, when they came near the land God had promised, the real test was not whether God had power. The test was whether they would trust that power when the promise looked dangerous. In Numbers chapter 13, Moses sends 12 men to spy out the land of Canaan, one man from each tribe. They are not sent to decide whether God's promise is true. God has already spoken. They are sent to see the land, bring back a report, and prepare the people to enter. And at first, the report sounds wonderful. The land is good. It flows with milk and honey. They even bring back fruit from the land, including a cluster of grapes so large it has to be carried on a pole between two men. That image matters. The people are standing in the wilderness, looking at fruit from the promise. They are not imagining the land. They are tasting evidence from it. But then comes one word that changes everything. Nevertheless, the land is good. Nevertheless, the people are strong. The fruit is real. Nevertheless, the cities are fortified. The promise is beautiful. Nevertheless, there are giants. That is the turning point. The spies do not deny the goodness of the land. They deny the possibility of obedience. 10 of the spies look at the same land, the same fruit, the same cities, and the same God who brought them out of Egypt. But they interpret everything through fear. Caleb and Joshua see something different. They do not pretend the giants are small. They do not say the cities are imaginary. Faith is not the refusal to see danger. Faith is the refusal to make danger bigger than God. Caleb says, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." But the 10 spies say, "We are not able." And with those words, the battle is lost before it begins. Not on the battlefield, in the imagination. Before Israel ever fights the giants, they are defeated by the story they tell themselves about the giants. That night, the camp weeps. The people cry out. They say it would have been better to die in Egypt or in the wilderness. Then they say something even more tragic. They want to choose a leader and go back to Egypt. This is the moment when the wilderness becomes more than a location. It becomes a mirror. Egypt was behind them physically, but it was still inside them spiritually. God had brought Israel out of slavery, but fear was still teaching them to think like slaves. They had been delivered from Pharaoh's hand, but not yet from Pharaoh's shadow. That is why the judgment is so severe. God declares that the generation who refused to enter the land will not inherit it. The men counted in the first census, from 20 years old and upward, will fall in the wilderness. Their children, the ones they claimed would become victims, will be the ones who enter, and the 40 years are tied to the 40 days the spies spent in the land. One day for each year. The punishment fits the pattern. They spent 40 days seeing the promise and chose fear. So they would spend 40 years learning the cost of unbelief. But this is not just a story about punishment. It is also a story about replacement. At the beginning of Numbers, Israel is counted. The first census counts the men able to go to war. This is the generation that came out of Egypt. They are numbered, organized, arranged by tribe, and placed around the tabernacle. Everything looks ready. The army is formed. The camp is ordered. The promise is ahead. But by the end of the wilderness years, that generation is gone. Then, in Numbers chapter 26, another census is taken, a second counting, a new generation, another army, another moment of readiness. That is not random. The book of Numbers is structured around two censuses. The first generation is counted and fails to enter. The second generation is counted and stands ready to inherit. One census at the beginning, one census near the end. One generation leaves Egypt. Another generation prepares to enter the land. The wilderness is the space between those two countings. And once you see that, the story changes. The 40 years are not just wandering. They are a funeral march and a formation ground. Every year in the wilderness means the old unbelieving generation is passing away. But every year also means the next generation is learning to live under the cloud, eat the manna, hear the law, and follow the presence of God. The wilderness buries one generation while training another. That is why the story feels so heavy. Israel does not simply lose time, they lose people. The camp moves through the desert. Parents die, leaders fall, names disappear, graves multiply. The wilderness becomes a long lesson, written in dust. And the lesson is this: you can be rescued from Egypt and still refuse the promise. You can see miracles and still be ruled by fear. You can stand near the land promised and still turn back in your heart. That is what makes the story so sobering. The issue was not distance. They were already close. The issue was trust. And trust is often tested most sharply, right at the edge of inheritance. But God does not abandon the promise. This is one of the most important parts of the story. The failure of one generation does not cancel the faithfulness of God. The wilderness delays the promise, but it does not destroy it. God remains faithful even when the people are faithless. He judges unbelief, but he also preserves a future. Joshua and Caleb survive because they had a different spirit. They saw the same giants as everyone else. They heard the same report. They walked through the same wilderness, but they carried a different conclusion. The 10 spies said, "We are not able." Caleb said, "We are well able." The difference was not eyesight, it was faith. Fear measured the giants against Israel. Faith measured the giants against God. And that is why the ending matters. After 40 years, Israel comes again to the edge of the land. This time, they are not standing at Kadesh, with spies returning from the hills. They are standing near the Jordan River. The old generation is gone. Moses is preparing to die. Joshua is preparing to lead. And the children who were once called weak are now the generation ready to cross. That is the reversal. The people their parents feared for become the people who finish the journey. The ones who were supposed to be victims become witnesses. The generation that was born in the wilderness enters the promise their parents refused. One generation saw the fruit and feared the giants. Another generation saw the river and followed the ark. One failed. One finished. And the deeper message is not simply, do not be afraid. The deeper message is this: fear does not merely make people feel weak. Fear can rewrite the story God is telling. God said, "I am giving you the land." The spies said, "We cannot take it." God said, "Your children will inherit." The people said, "Our children will be prey." God said, "Go forward." They said, "Let us go back." That is what unbelief does. It takes the words of God and replaces them with the logic of fear. And once fear becomes the narrator, even the promise looks like a threat. That is why the wilderness still speaks. Because many people live at the edge of obedience. They are not in Egypt anymore, but they have not entered what God placed before them either. They have enough evidence to trust, but enough fear to hesitate. They can see the fruit, but they keep talking about the giants. They can point to the promise, but they cannot step into it. And the danger is not always rebellion that looks dramatic. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. The cities are large. The people are strong. The risk is real. The timing is hard. The cost is high, All of that may be true. But the question is never only, are the giants real? The question is God faithful? That is where Israel failed. Not because Canaan was easy, but because they treated difficulty as if it disproved the promise. And that is what the 40 years expose. The wilderness reveals what people really believe after the miracle is over. At the Red Sea, everyone can sing. At the border of Canaan, faith has to move. The first generation had enough faith to leave slavery, but not enough faith to enter inheritance. And that is a warning. But it is also an invitation, because the story does not end with graves in the wilderness. It ends with a new generation at the river. It ends with Joshua. It ends with God still keeping his word. The promise survives the failure. The land remains. The river opens. The people enter. So why did Israel wander for 40 years? Because a generation that had seen God's power refused to trust God's promise. Because fear turned the edge of inheritance into a place of retreat. Because God would not let unbelief inherit what faith was meant to receive, but also because God was forming another generation, a generation that would not only see the promise from a distance, but walk into it. That is the pattern. One generation counted the giants. Another generation followed the presence. One generation asked to go back. Another generation crossed the river. One failed. One finished. And the question this story leaves behind is not only whether Israel trusted God at the edge of Canaan. The question is what we do when we stand at the edge of obedience. Do we count the giants, or do we remember the God who brought us this far? The wilderness is a warning, but the river is still ahead.